I was in a couple of networks and I reached out to some people on those networks to say, hey, I want to start a podcast. It's going to be an interview format, if you like. I want to bring guests on. I want to have conversations with those guests about their business and what they've learned on their journey and what they can share with the listener.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
What's up, podcaster? It's your host, Adam A. Adams, and it's going to be a fun episode. Fun because, A, the guy that I'm recording with today is done already 550 episodes as we're recording. So over 500, almost 600 episodes. That's one reason why it's going to be cool. Number two, it's because it's only 7 a.m. where he's from because he lives in Australia. Number three, he has a badass accent. And number four, he knows a thing or two about business. So I want to go through a little bit about what he knows about business, but really about the podcast. Because if you've done 500 to 600 episodes, you probably learned something along the way. You might have changed something today that you didn't do last time. And he's going to streamline your success because you want to learn this stuff. And I don't want you learning just from somebody who's only produced one episode and is still learning. Today, you get to listen to somebody who's been doing it for a while. And the fifth reason, I was using letters, right? A, B, C, D. So this is E. Is because we're actually recording on a completely different platform than I've ever recorded before. And it's because, those people who say Zoom is crappy. So we are actually recording on Riverside, and Jürgen Strauss, who's my guest today, the person who's done 500 to 600 episodes already, we're recording on his platform with Riverside, and he's going to send it to my team. And so when you're getting this, it's going to be a little bit different. So you be the judge. Is the audio better? Is the video better? You tell me. Write it in the show notes. What's up, Jürgen? How are you today?
I'm great, Adam. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for the patience in sorting out all the issues. And it's a silent J, by the way. It's Jürgen. So whilst I have this cool Aussie accent, I'm German by birth, and it's a German name.
Okay. Jürgen. I love it.
That's it.
I love it. Now I feel like a dummy because here's podcasting 101. This is podcasting 101. You freaking know what your guest's name is and how to pronounce it before you start recording. And I totally effed that up. And it's recorded for the world to hear how bad Adam Adams, the podcast on podcasting, doesn't even do number one. So it's Jürgen Strauss. Or am I saying Strauss wrong also?
No, that's correct. You could pronounce it with a German accent, but we won't.
Oh, show me how to do that.
Strauss.
As if I could say that. Strauss. How close was I?
That's not bad.
Not bad. I'll go for not bad. So, like I mentioned before, we're recording on Riverside, my first time ever. I've been interviewed on other people's shows where we use Riverside, but this is the first time that it'll come on my recording. So I'm curious if my listener thinks the recording is better or worse. So if you're listening to this one, what I would like you to do is just go listen to the last episode, also listen to the next episode. They're probably both done on Zoom. Listen to this one. Be as careful and conscious as you can, and you tell me if it sounds better. But he was having something strange. It was like his podcast mic was popping when on Zoom, but then we moved to Riverside and it's not popping anymore. So I demand a decent enough recording, and the popping, I wasn't good with that. Jürgen, 550 episodes. I just want to start here. Your podcast, InnovaBuzz, is already in the show notes. Your bio is already in the show notes. So I want to start with a question. What did you learn from episodes 1 to episode 50 that you want to share with the listener right now? I know you're at 550, but I'm just thinking, go way back hundreds of episodes ago and tell me, what did you change from episode 1 to episode 50?
I think one of the biggest things I changed in the beginning, I scripted out very carefully each episode. Now, in the early days, I did do solo episodes in between my interviews. I don't like the word interviews. I like to use conversation because I like to have a meaningful conversation with somebody rather than interview where I say question 1, okay, thanks for your answer, question 2. So I like to have a conversational style. So I set out with that. But in the early days, I didn't trust myself to be able to carry a conversation. And I scripted it very carefully. And listening back to some of those early episodes, they were very stilted. I think by the time I got to episode 50, I realized that scripting them very carefully, most of the time I was going off script by about the second question anyway. And I thought, well, why put in all this effort to script something very carefully that I throw out the window about 5 minutes into the conversation anyway? Then said, I will trust myself to carry a conversation. I will write down 5 to 7 things that I want to touch on and have a conversation around those 5 to 7 things. One of the things that highlighted that for me, my second episode ever. You'd think the first episode was pretty awful. The third to the 10th were probably pretty ordinary as well. The second one was pretty good. And the key there was, it was somebody I had known for a long time. They were the CEO and business owner of a large company. I had a long-standing relationship with them. When we got on the call, we agreed what we were going to talk about. It was a conversation between friends. And I thought, that's what I've got to do. I've got to get to this point of having a conversation between people that essentially friends and are just sharing knowledge. So that's probably the key lesson, and trusting myself that I can carry that conversation even with people that I've only just met for the first time.
Yeah. All right. I want to ask you a couple things here. When you say instead of you learn not to carefully script, because in many cases you were throwing it out the window because you were letting the conversation go where it was needed to go and where it was organic. You definitely were adding value. And sometimes you couldn't actually ask all the questions. And sometimes you didn't want to once you heard maybe a response. You learned this in the episodes 1 through 50. And you switched it to having 5 to 7 things that you kind of wanted to highlight or kind of wanted to get to. In my experience, 5 to 7 things is usually too much.
Yeah.
This is just me.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how you are able to do 5 to 7, or if it was 5 to 7 and now it's 1 to 2 or something else like that, So tell me a little bit about the 5 to 7 and how that's going for you, or how it went through for you from episodes 1 through 50 and then beyond.
Yeah. One of the things I learned then with those 5, I still do 5 to 7 in terms of my preparation. I write down 5 to 7 things. Mm-hmm. You're right. Usually I get to 1 or 2 of those. Okay. Maybe we'll get to 3. Often those 5 to 7 are actually interrelated anyway, because what I'll do is I put people now through an application process. I don't really call it an application process. Essentially, they're providing me the background information, and particularly if they pitch me to come on the show, they've got a message they want to share. They've got something they want to bring to my platform. So I ask them, well, what is that? And if that's a match for my audience, if that's something I'm curious about, then that'll form the basis for our conversation. And as you say, we usually dig deep on 1 or 2 things. Those 5 to 7 are just the list I start with.
Okay. So here's what I think I'm hearing. Totally correct me if I'm wrong. You don't want to have nothing to say at all or nothing to ask. So you think of a small handful of things that you could ask, that if it gets awkward, if it gets quiet, if it gets stale, you've got some things in front of you that you could go to.
Yeah,
they're
exactly.
all around the same topic, but it's kind of like helping you to make sure that you've always got something. And so you get to a place and you feel like it might be the end of it. And then you kind of look at these lists of 5 to 7 things and you just go ahead and pick one. And you might only get to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of them. You don't have to go all 5 or all 7, but having something in front of you allows it to be able to kind of go into a place. And you might even notice, hey, they already answered that. There's no reason for me to ask that.
That's
you
right,
go to a different one. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
That's kind of what it is, yeah. And they're not questions. They're just kind of a bullet list of topics, really.
Okay.
And The way I structure it, I will introduce the guest very briefly. I will ask them the first question, which is always along the lines of, what's the impact you're making in the world today? And then I just listen really carefully to what they tell me. And usually that will prompt the next conversation. And I would say for 80 to 90% of the guests, I don't refer to my list anymore after that, because they've given me a couple of things in their first answer that leads to the conversation, and the conversation just flows from there. And that's probably something that over the years, I've just become more and more confident that even as an introvert, and I'm actually an introvert, that when I meet somebody new, I can start off a conversation with a deep question like that in that sort of setting, and then carry a conversation on from there to dig into their expertise and get them to share some stuff that might be helpful. Well, certainly would be helpful to me, and hopefully will be helpful to my listeners.
Loving this. Second thing that I want to mention or bring out, because Jürgen, I'm saying it with a soft J now.
That's really good. I like the way you rolled the R as well.
You also mentioned that your first 10 episodes were, I'm going to use a word that you didn't use, okay-ish.
Yeah.
They weren't that great, the first 10, except for episode 2, which was a little bit more remarkable, and you had a conversation with a friend. What I'm thinking, if I'm listening, but I haven't yet launched my podcast, is I'm thinking everybody that's ever talked about their first episode, or the first 10 episodes, or the first 30 episodes, in Jürgen's case, it's the 10. Everybody who's ever said it says their first X amount of episodes were shitty.
Yeah.
Or okay-ish, we'll call it. My first such and such. And so I might be wondering, A, how do I make them not okay-ish? And B, should I just not do a podcast at all because I know that my first 10 are not going to be that good? So Jürgen, what would you say to the listener who's trying to make sense of all but episode 2 for you out of the first 10 you weren't so happy with? What should they do either to be better or to be okay with subpar content?
Well, when I say they were ordinary or they were subpar, that's
ordinary. Sorry, that was your word. Ordinary.
That's
not okay-ish.
Reflecting back on them now.
Okay.
At the time, I felt very uncomfortable doing it, but I was reasonably happy that I'd done them, and I felt comfortable sharing the conversations with my audience and growing my audience on the back of those conversations. One of the things I did at the beginning, and this is something that I'd certainly recommend people do, is I was in a couple of networks, and I reached out to some people on those networks to say, hey, I want to start a podcast. It's going to be an interview format, if you like. I want to bring guests on. I want to have conversations with those guests about their business and what lessons they've learned on their journey and what they can share with the listener. Would anybody like to practice with me? And I did about 6 or 7 practice recordings that we never published, and they weren't necessarily people that fit my audience or my topics. It was simply a way for me to practice speaking with them. And then at the end of that, I said, how was that for you? Do you have any feedback for me? So I got them to kind of critique me as the guest of the episode. The other thing that I then took into the actual episodes is at the end of each episode, when we debrief, I asked the guest, what did you like? What can I improve on? What can I do better? So that in every episode, I'll get some sort of feedback from the guest, and often there'll be something there that I can consider for improving and changing for the future. The other thing, which I didn't do at the time, but is available to us now, at the time there weren't so many directories where you could guest podcast on other people's shows. I would go on as many shows of somebody else as possibly you can when you're first starting out as a guest, because that will help you refine your message, that will help you practice conversations with people, and it'll also give you a sense of how good podcasters, or how experienced podcasters, put it that way, how they run their systems.
Awesome. So much good stuff. I can't wait for the wrap up of this. So here's something just for my listener. I try to basically, in a podcast episode, I try to say, tell them what you're going to tell them. That's step one. And then the middle is tell them. And then the end is tell them what you told them. And so, for example, in a way, when you and I were starting, Jürgen, when we just barely started this episode and we started recording, I mentioned to the listener, here's a person, here's kind of what you're going to get. So I tried to tell them what we were going to tell them. And in the middle, we're giving all this content. And at the end, when we're done, I do what's called wrapping it up. And the takeaways from you are much larger. I'm not trying to offend any other guest that's ever come on this podcast. I will just have to say that if that guest is listening right now, you might not have had 550 episodes to kind of gain your craft. Jürgen's really crushing it at this, and his business supports people with the same thing. So he's got a lot of experience. And as such, I cannot wait to wrap up this episode with the tell them what you told them. Basically giving the value that we're getting from Jürgen today, which is deep. I'm stoked. I've got so many notes already. All right. Next thing that I want to go to is the introvert. You mentioned one benefit that you could do was to start with a deep question. One thing that I do, and I'm going to plug a company that I affiliate for, it's called Poddex. Poddex got a few interview decks. And these are kind of like deep questions, but it's not the one that you have. The one that you have is, I think it's, what's the impact of what you're working on today? Is that right? Is that how you phrase it?
It's even more generic than that. It's what's the impact you're making in the world today?
What's the impact of what you're making in the world today? Jürgen, I want you to have your answer queued up because I'm about to turn the tables onto you. Before I do that and give you time to think about what you're doing to impact the world, asking an in-depth question, a deep question is a pretty cool way to start. And pod decks are neat because what you can do is you can ask these random questions like, who's your hero? Who's your top this? Or what would you go to space if you could? There's just a bunch of different questions in these. And it's kind of a fun way, whether you're introverted or not, to learn something about somebody. Because I've got 2 of these. And so that's 100 questions. They're 50 each. 100 random questions that I could ask Jürgen right now and get to know something about him at a deeper level and an interesting level. And it can add to our banter. It can add to our communication. It can add to it's like the chemistry, if you will, of the conversation where I get to know something about you and I can share my answer as well. And so pod decks are a really cool way. Or you can say, what's the impact you're making on the world today? Whatever it is, I love that. And I'll say my first question, whenever I ask, it's never, listen carefully if you are taking notes, I never say, Jürgen Strauss, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into it. I never say that. I want to say something a little bit more, I want to care about something a little bit more impactful or profound or beneficial to my listener. If I only ask Jürgen, how did he get started? How did he get into this business or something like that? Then you're going to be bored as heck. Being like, no offense, Jürgen, you're a cool person. It's just that doesn't always apply to the listener.
Exactly.
When you ask a question like, what's the impact that you were making on the world today? Or who's your hero? Or would you go to space if you could? It kind of changes and you can learn something. The biggest takeaway I want to share now is what Jürgen said after he asks the question. What does he say he does? He sits there and just listens carefully. And in a way, I've been doing that now. In a way, I've taken detailed notes of like everything Jürgen said, and he spent, 3 minutes explaining something? And then I've got all of these different notes of all these points that we can go back to. And I think that that's what Jürgen's saying. He listens carefully, and it helps him take that direction. you're listening. You've gotten a ton of value because Jürgen said a couple minutes of stuff, and now we've gone deep in a few of those things. So anyway, let's turn this into a couple things. Whether you're introverted or extroverted, ask a cool question like that. And I'm just going to ask Jürgen, I'm going to turn the table because I don't know if he always gets to be answering this. So what are you doing to impact the world?
Yeah, great question, by the way.
I can't claim all credit for that.
Yeah. Yeah. What am I doing to impact the world? I've been around for quite some time. So this is something that I kind of think of from time to time. If I'm no longer here, what's left of me? And I think obviously the podcast is here and so on, but there's a lot of things we do around the podcast and we do in our business. And the philosophy of the business is to make marketing and make podcasting human again. And it's all about building human connection and making a difference in the world. Now, we think that to make a difference in the world, you need to be famous or you need to be really wealthy in a monetary sense, and you can do spectacular things. But you don't need to be rich or famous to make a difference in the world. All you need to do is care. And if we care, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, is building this culture of care within all of us. And it starts with caring for ourselves, then caring for others, then caring for our communities and caring for our environments. So I think that's where I'm making an impact on the world, and I'm doing that through my business. I'm doing that through public speaking, in all of the podcasts we do. One of the reasons for that question is to establish a kind of a deeper connection with my guest, because going back to that episode 2, where it was a friend of mine and we had that really good conversation, that connection is something that I want to try to establish very early on. And we also run events inside of our community of podcast guests where I use a different system to the cards you mentioned, but I'll have to check those out, where we ask those deep questions and connect people and get them very quickly to the point where they care about the other person in the sense of what are they doing and what can we, and that's led to some amazing things in terms of people getting together for joint venture initiatives or do business with one another, or just to keep in touch and act as sounding boards for one another for things that they're doing. So I think that kind of are some examples of that impact that I'm hoping to make in the world and the legacy that I'm hoping to leave.
I'm loving it. Really good stuff. And so this whole thing about listening is a really cool takeaway, because we could take this podcast episode from where we are now into so many different places. For example, I'm just trying to help the listener right now. He says, it really starts with caring. And then as he explained that, he said, basically step 1 was caring for ourselves. Step 2 is caring for others. Step 3 is caring about our community. Step 4 is caring about the environment. And it was kind of like, put your own mask on first, go here, go here, go here. And so I'm paying attention, I'm taking notes. And if I wanted, I could say, Jürgen, I have a hard time sometimes caring about others. I'm really good and selfish, and I can easily care about myself. And I could ask Jürgen, can you give me and the listener a couple of tips on how can we care more about others? Or I could ask a different question. I could say, well, that's really interesting. And you went ourselves, others, the community, and the environment. And then I could ask, what do we need to do to care about in the environment? Or how long does it take to care about the environment? Or what are you doing today to care about the environment? So I could throw his own words against him and whatever he says. He also said he's doing that through his business and public speaking. So I could switch and ask a different question if I wanted to, because I listened. I could say, how are you getting public speaking gigs? Where are you speaking? Are you doing it internationally? I could do all these follow-up questions about that. Or I could say, how is your business helping others, the community, and the environment? Or I could ask, he mentioned that asking this question helps him have a deeper connection with his guest. So I could ask, Jürgen, why is it important to have a deep connection with your guest? Well, he kind of already answered that. He said it establishes it early on. And we kind of already mentioned that it can benefit the connection here. So many different things. He also talked about you don't have to be rich. You don't have to be famous. And so I could say, so if the listener's listening and they're not rich, they're not famous, what are 2 tips that you would have in order to help them, blah, 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 blah. So I love that takeaway of just listening. And because I heard you say so many things, Jürgen, and we could like break it up in any way. And I think it's important to think about your listener, your avatar, as you're doing that. And I want to get into that with you. You've got a podcast. It's almost named the same thing as your business. So you've got InnovaBiz, the company, links already in the show notes. And then you've got InnovaBuzz, your podcast, links already in the show notes. What I'm thinking and wondering, because you help podcasters, you help business people, you help us to be more humanizing in our interactions and things like that. What I'm curious of is for the listener who's got a podcast that they want to grow their business, like really, honestly, what are you doing in your podcast 550 episodes later to feed into the business? Because I think it's important that you are not taking money out of your pocket every month for your podcast, but that the podcast helps you put money into your pocket. I think that's important.
It is.
What are you doing to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And when I first started the podcast, it was on the advice of a mentor who said, this will be a good positioning tool for you. And you can talk about innovation, which is kind of one of the things that underpins our business. And that opened up the opportunity for me to speak to a lot of people that I already had connections with, such as that person in episode 2. So there were a bunch of episodes between 10 and 50 that I knew, and I thought that's easy to reach out to those people, and it grew from there. The other thing, I guess I didn't talk about this when you asked that question earlier, in that first 50 episodes, was I realized that this was pretty time intensive for me. There was a lot of preparation involved. In the early days, I did the editing myself, so there was a lot of work involved. It was a time investment, and also there are some costs involved. So hosting of the audio files, I needed a website and so on. So I pretty quickly realized, well, how's this going to contribute back to the business? And what we do today, apart from the fact that because we've got this experience now of 550 plus episodes and people come to us and say, well, can you help me get started, or can you help me improve my podcast, or can you help me edit, because we don't want to do the editing or the production part of it. That's come about as a result of us doing the podcast and people seeing the podcast. The other thing we do is we're building community around our podcast. So this is the big thing for me, is building community around the podcast. We bring together all of the guests we've had on the show into a community. We run events in that community. We add value to our podcast guests after they've been on the show. And that's resulted in business for me from those guests, but it's also resulted in opportunities for those guests to do business with one another, or, as I said earlier, joint ventures and other things. We're building that community, and next year we will be making that community available to our podcast listeners and bringing those on, so that when I'm talking to somebody like you, Adam, on my show, and we have a conversation, the listener says, gee, of those 20 things you just mentioned that you could have followed up on, I would have loved to hear you follow up on X, but you didn't. You went down path Y. So being in that community, they can then reach out to you and say, hey, Adam, I listened to your podcast episode. I'd love to have a conversation with you around X. I'd love to explore that some more. And that hopefully will lead to an opportunity for you to build a relationship with that particular listener of my podcast where you're a guest on, and lead to business for you. And that, of course, the privilege for the listeners to be part of that community is something that we'll charge for as well. We're also doing an experiment right now with blockchain and NFTs and minting digital tokens for people to actually have permanent records of each interview, which is something that is, as I said, it's an experiment, it's early days, and whether that'll lead to a revenue stream or not, yet to be decided. But it's a nice way for me personally just to learn a little bit more about how you can use the blockchain technology not as an investment, but as a tool to help with the podcast or with any creative kind of production.
Cool. I got a couple questions though. First and foremost, this community that soon is going to include listeners and probably for a price, but today includes the 500-ish people that you've interviewed.
Yeah.
Is that on Facebook?
No, it's not.
What is it?
It's on a platform called Heartbeat. So it's a custom domain. There's nothing else there. So the only reason you would go there is to engage with that community. It does operate very much like a Facebook group, but of course, because it's a standalone platform, it doesn't have any of the other noise there.
Okay. No other noise. Got it. So you've got this place. It's resulted in business for you. My next question is, when did you launch this community? How many episodes had you had out at the time that you decided to launch it?
That's a really good question. We launched the platform earlier this year. I think about March this year, we launched the platform. We were running events through my podcast guests, but we didn't sort of formally have this platform and the community identified as such. So when COVID hit back in early 2020 and people were in lockdown and couldn't get out to in-person meetings, I thought, what can I do to bring people together so that they still get that sort of experience of having conversations with others in group settings. So we started running these events back in March of 2020, and that was the platform for launching this community platform where people could have those conversations regardless of whether I was there to run an event or not. So they could go into that platform and talk to people.
So give me just the shortest answer you possibly can. Approximately how many episodes were launched when you decided to do that?
300. I think it was the first episode was built around celebrating 300 episodes, if I remember correctly.
Follow-up question from the 300-ish. If you could have launched this platform sooner, how many episodes would you have been in? So I'm curious if the listener's thinking, should I have 300 episodes and then start a community, or should I do the community a little bit earlier? And if I do it earlier, when is that?
If I had my time over, I would have started the community at episode 0.
I love it. Okay, episode 0. So you learned all of this along the way, and you've just streamlined our listener to think about the community and not waste 300 episodes.
That's right. Yep.
We'll call it waste for now. Next question is, you're still kind of learning different things. You're still growing, you as a podcaster, obviously, so am I. And one of those things is we're in episode 550 or plus, getting close to 600. And now is when you're thinking, hey, I'm going to open this up to my guests, but also my listener. So you're learning that. I want to just know, what have you implemented? You went through episode 0 through 50. You talked about episode 300. And now what I'm absolutely curious of, and I think the listener is too, and I think this will help us streamline more things.
Yeah.
What did Jürgen learn from episode 450 to 550? After he had already been doing 450 episodes, just in the last 100 episodes, what is 1 or 2 takeaways for the listener that you've learned that you can help them streamline? We're going to answer that question as soon as we get back from this quick break. Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, GrowYourShow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show. We're back with Jürgen Strauss, and we've learned a lot of really cool things. He's done 550 episodes. We talked about what he learned from 0 to 50, what he learned at episode 300, his community, and so much more. Right now that we're back from the break, I just want to find out, what did he learn in just the last 100 episodes from 450 to 550 that he can pour into you? One or two things. Jürgen, take it away.
Yeah, a couple of things that come to mind when you ask that question. One of them is continuously improving our process. So I'm a strong believer in process, and we've had process right from the get-go, but we've really streamlined it now to automate as much as possible to make it really easy. So, for example, we have guests, when they apply, they provide all the information in a form that I've set up, and that form will actually build the episode notes right from the get-go. So it'll populate in Notion a document that will contain all the links to the website, to their social media profile, to their podcast if they have one, to their books if they've put those in. It will also put in the discussion points that they want to touch on, and their email. And I also ask them for their birth date so that I can send them a friendly greeting on their birthday, part of making podcasting human again. So all of that happens in the background and is there ready, and also the date when I have to go in there and start preparing for that conversation will come up, and that reminder will then come up. So I'll have all that information straight away when I get to that preparation. So that's one thing that we've probably implemented a lot of those automations in the last 100 or so episodes. The other one that comes to mind, and this came out of a conversation with Phil, I think it's Phil M. Jones, who wrote a couple of books around exactly what to say and exactly how to sell, I think they're called. And he has a really great way with language. And he gave me the feedback that at the end, here's how you wrap up, here's how you get a call to action out of this. And so probably in the last 50 or 60 episodes, ever since that episode with Phil, I've done the wrap up where I have a very specific single call to action. And I ask my guests now at the end, I used to ask them, what's your top leadership tip? I've changed that to, what do you want the guest to take away and turn into an action from our conversation today? And I will then summarize that.
Awesome. I like it. I like all of that. We've added tons of value. I've learned a lot. I think the listeners gotten a ton of value. I do want to, just like Jürgen said, after he gets whatever the single call to action, he does summarize things. Remember, tell him what you're going to tell him. Then you tell him. Then you tell him what you told him. And I think it's important to tell you what we told you today, because there is a lot. Takeaway number one, Jürgen was talking about how he doesn't like to call it an interview. He likes to call it a conversation. He doesn't like to think of it as, I'm going to ask you a question. You're going to respond. I'm going to ask you the next question that I have pre-scripted, and then you're going to respond, and we just keep moving through that, and it seems real robotic. Instead, he likes it to be a conversation. Number two is he learned to stop scripting. He talked about some of the pros and cons of scripting, and he went to something else where it was 5 to 7 things. He talked about how he doesn't even have to go through all of 5 to 7 things. He might even just do 1 or 2 or 3. Next is that it's okay to be okay-ish or ordinary. It's okay to be ordinary. And on the first ones, don't be afraid of it. Jürgen thought his were fine. He was happy with them. But as he learned and he did 30 and 60 and 100 and 500, we start to notice what could have changed at the first one. Some of us cringe. I cringed. And it's okay. It doesn't mean you shouldn't start. Another thing is the question and the listening part. You ask an interesting question, not just tell me how you got into this business, but actually ask a thoughtful, thought-provoking question, and then take your time to listen. He talked about how it's okay to be an introvert, and you can still start with a deep question. Another one, random thing that he passed through quickly is, as you're starting your podcast, it might be a good idea to have 6 or 7 practice recordings. What's a practice recording? A recording that you don't even record. You never are going to use. And what he did is on his social, he just said, does anybody want to help me? The next one is after the 6 to 7 recordings, he continues to ask people, even at the end of episode 551, he's going to ask, hey, what did you like? That's number one. And what can I improve on? What did you like? What can I improve on? And as you, a podcaster who wants to grow and be better, it's important for you to know what you did well and what you could fix. And Jürgen is still asking that question, even at 551, 552, 553. And the next thing, he talked about how guesting helped him learn more about his practice, his profession, and to refine, to learn from all those other people that have been there, that done that. And he's still loving guesting. And he talked about some ways that he gets more guesting spots. Talk about starting with your care, deeper connection with the guest. You don't have to be rich and famous. His mentor said he needed to be a podcaster. So he did it and it's working. And then another question that you should ask if you're a podcaster. What's this going to do for my business? You got a business? What is it going to do for my business? We can't just go around having a random old podcast that doesn't have any intention of impacting lives or making an income. Think about it as, how is this going to support me? And that asking that questions helped him to be able to hone in. Building a community is one of the things that he built. And he's actually going to add that to more people. It's resulted in business for him, with his guests, and with others within that group. And then the final takeaways that we got from him is, even recently, after 450 episodes, 550 episodes, he's learning to continuously improve the process, the automation, as much as possible. Automate as much things as he can. He gave some suggestions. And after reading Phil's book, number 2 is to switch to a single CTA, a single call to action. A lot of podcasters mess this up by trying to tell people to do all these random things. But Phil wants to ask one thing. And what I love about it is he and his guest make sure that thing helps the listener to get to the next level. And so with that, Jürgen, the last thing I want to ask you is, what's the next thing the listener should do after listening to this episode?
Well, I think the first thing they should do is take a lot of notes from your summary. I think that's pretty amazing. And I'm going to do that too, because you've clearly listened really well. And going back to what I said about culture of care, one of the things we can all do to care is really listen to others. And that's a key skill, I think, that everybody can focus on. If they're doing conversations in a podcast or in video, or any conversation in a networking event, any conversation, is to really focus on that listening. And there's a couple of things that come to mind, a couple of quotes that come to mind. One is from Bill Nye, the science guy, who said, everybody you meet in the world knows something that you don't. So having that curiosity, really carefully listen if you meet somebody, and what do they know that I don't know, and what can I learn from them? And the other thing I'll leave you with is that word ordinary. To get to extraordinary or remarkable, you have to pass through ordinary. Now, I don't know who that quote was from, but it stuck in my mind when I heard it.
Ordinary to extraordinary. Jürgen, you can drop your mic. Thank you so much for jumping on the podcast, for sharing your experience.
Thank you, Adam.
Your company, InnovaBiz, is in the show notes. Your podcast, InnovaBuzz, is in the show notes. Your bio's in the show notes. That's where the listener can find you, get a hold of you, connect with you, hire you, whatever they're looking for. I would suggest you go and check out his podcast. He's putting out some great content, and he's continuing to do it. And you know he's going to be around for a while because he's already 500 plus episodes into it. I hope that you who's listening knows that the next episode is just you and I. It's me pouring into you, the listener. It's a solo episode, and there's some information that I've cultivated because I know you, I know what you need, and I've created a solo episode just for you, and it's on the next episode. I'll see you there. If you're glad that you checked out the podcast today, if you got some value out of this episode, some actionable takeaways, I invite you to do one of 3 things. A, you could do a written review on Apple. Let us know what you think. Just an honest written review. B, you could share the podcast with a friend of yours who needs it. Or C, at the very least, implement what you've learned to take your business and your podcast to the next level. And I'll see you on the next episode.